For 42 years, I opened my home to anyone who needed shelter, love, or a warm meal. My dining room table seated 8, but somehow we always managed to squeeze in one more chair, one more plate, one more soul who needed belonging. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I raised my son Ryan in that house on Pine Ridge Avenue, watching him grow from a curious toddler to a successful man, always teaching him that family meant everything, and that our door would never be closed to those we loved. But the night my daughter-in-law Stephanie served me a plate of cold leftovers while she and Ryan enjoyed a feast I had paid for, I realized that some people mistake kindness for weakness, generosity for obligation, and a mother's love for a lifetime of servitude. The irony wasn't lost on me that evening as I stared down at the scraped remnants of what had once been a beautiful roast dinner. 3 small pieces of overcooked beef, a spoonful of congealed gravy, and vegetables that had clearly seen better days adorned the chipped plate Stephanie had slid across the counter to me with barely concealed disdain. Meanwhile, she and Ryan sat at my dining room table, the table I had polished every week for decades, enjoying generous portions of the meal I had purchased with my own money, cooked in my own kitchen, served on china that had belonged to my grandmother. The foundation of this story began long before that humiliating evening, rooted in decisions made with love that somehow transformed into expectations I never anticipated. When my husband Thomas died 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack, the world felt like it had tilted off its axis. Ryan was 34 then, married to Stephanie for just 2 years, and they were struggling financially in ways that reminded me painfully of my own early years as a young mother. Without hesitation, I invited them to move into my spacious Victorian home on Pine Ridge Avenue, the house Thomas and I had bought when Ryan was just 5 years old, the house where every room held memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet family dinners. My motivation was pure. The house felt enormous and empty without Thomas's laughter echoing through the halls, and having Ryan and Stephanie there brought life back into those rooms. Ryan had always been a good son, thoughtful and caring, and Stephanie seemed sweet enough in those early days, though I noticed even then how she had a way of making small comments that stung just slightly, like paper cuts you don't notice until later when they start to burn. She would mention how outdated my furniture was, how the neighborhood wasn't quite what she was used to, how the guest bedroom they occupied wasn't really suited for a couple of their age and status. But I overlooked these remarks, attributing them to the stress of their financial situation and the adjustment of living with a mother-in-law. What started as a temporary arrangement to help them get back on their feet gradually became permanent in ways that none of us explicitly discussed, but everyone seemed to accept. Months turned into years, and their occasional contributions to household expenses became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. I found myself not only providing free housing, but also covering groceries, utilities, household repairs, and maintenance costs that seemed to multiply as the house aged. My retirement income from my 40 years as an administrative assistant at Hartford Medical Center was comfortable enough to support myself, but stretching it to cover 3 adults required careful budgeting and sacrifices I made quietly, never wanting Ryan to feel like a burden. The dynamic shifted gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize the transformation until it was complete. What began as my desire to help became their expectation of support. Stephanie started treating the house like it was hers, rearranging furniture without asking, redecorating the living room with items she purchased using money I gave Ryan for their personal expenses, and establishing household rules that somehow always seemed to benefit her comfort while restricting mine. She preferred the air conditioning much colder than I could tolerate, so I found myself wearing sweaters in my own home during summer months. She didn't like the smell of the fish I occasionally cooked, so fish disappeared from my diet entirely. She complained about the noise from my morning television programs, so I started watching with subtitles to avoid disturbing her sleep. Ryan caught between his wife and his mother, seemed to choose the path of least resistance, which inevitably meant supporting Stephanie's preferences over mine. When I expressed concern about the increasing costs of supporting 3 people on my fixed income, he would acknowledge my sacrifices with gratitude that felt genuine, promising they were actively working to improve their situation and move out soon. These promises became a recurring theme in our conversations, always sincere in the moment, but somehow never materializing into actual change. The most painful part wasn't the financial strain or even the gradual loss of control over my own living space. It was watching my relationship with Ryan slowly erode under the weight of Stephanie's growing resentment toward me. She had a remarkable ability to create situations where I appeared unreasonable for asserting any preferences in my own home. If I suggested we needed to discuss household expenses, she would tearfully tell Ryan that I was making her feel unwelcome and guilty about their financial struggles. If I asked about their timeline for moving out, she would interpret this as pressure and rejection, leading to arguments between her and Ryan that somehow always ended with him apologizing to her and asking me to be more patient and understanding. The isolation crept in gradually as well. My longtime friends found it increasingly difficult to visit comfortably, as Stephanie had a way of making guests feel like they were intruding on her space rather than visiting mine. She would emerge from the bedroom in her pajamas when visitors arrived, acting surprised and slightly put out by their presence, or she would monopolize conversations with complaints about her job, her health, or her family in ways that left little room for others to speak. Eventually, most of my friends stopped coming by regularly, instead inviting me to meet them elsewhere, which created additional expenses I struggled to manage within my tightened budget. My attempts to maintain some independence and social connections were met with subtle sabotage. When I planned to attend my monthly book club meeting, Stephanie would suddenly develop a crisis that required my immediate attention or support. When I wanted to visit my sister Margaret in neighboring Brantford, there would be some household emergency that made leaving inconvenient or inappropriate. When I expressed interest in taking a watercolor painting class at the Cedar Valley Community Center, Stephanie worried aloud about the cost and whether it was wise for someone my age to be driving to evening activities. The most insidious aspect of this gradual takeover was how it was disguised as concern for my well-being. Stephanie frequently mentioned how I seemed tired, how I was getting older, how I might benefit from a quieter lifestyle with fewer responsibilities and social obligations. She would point out times when I forgot small details or needed help with technology, using these normal signs of aging as evidence that I needed more support and protection rather than less interference in my life. Her narrative gradually painted me as someone who was becoming fragile and dependent, even as I continued to provide the financial and practical support that kept their lives stable. The professional relationship I had maintained with Mr. Benjamin Walsh, the chief administrator at Hartford Medical Center where I had worked for 4 decades, became a crucial lifeline during this period. Even after my retirement, Benjamin would call occasionally to check on me or invite me to lunch when he was in the neighborhood. He had worked closely with me for the last 15 years of my career and had developed a genuine respect for my organizational skills, my dedication, and my ability to manage complex situations with grace under pressure. During our conversations, he would often mention how much the medical center missed my expertise and how difficult it had been to replace someone with my institutional knowledge and reliability. Benjamin had a way of seeing through social pleasantries to the reality beneath, and I suspect he recognized that something in my life wasn't quite right during our periodic meetings. I was always carefully dressed and polite during our lunches, but he seemed to notice the subtle signs of stress and financial strain that I tried to hide. My clothes were a bit more worn than they had been during my working years. I was more careful about ordering less expensive items from the menu, and I had a tendency to deflect questions about my home life or family situation in ways that suggested discomfort rather than privacy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I didn't realize during those years of gradual accommodation and compromise was that Benjamin had been quietly concerned about my post-retirement well-being for reasons that extended beyond simple friendship. The medical center had undergone significant changes after my retirement, including transitions in administrative staff and procedures that had created challenges no one had anticipated. Several times during our conversations, Benjamin had mentioned how valuable my knowledge and experience would be in helping them navigate these transitions, but I had assumed these were simply compliments rather than genuine offers. The turning point in this slowly deteriorating situation came during what should have been a celebration. Ryan had finally received a significant promotion at his job with an insurance company, an advancement he had been working toward for 3 years. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, and more importantly, the financial stability that would theoretically enable him and Stephanie to afford their own place. I was genuinely thrilled for his success and suggested we celebrate, with a special dinner at home, offering to prepare his favorite meal of roast beef with all the traditional accompaniments. I spent the entire day preparing for this celebration, shopping for the finest ingredients my budget could accommodate, using recipes that had been family favorites for decades, and setting the dining room table with my best china and silverware. The house filled with the warm, savory aromas of a home-cooked feast, and I felt a happiness I hadn't experienced in months at the prospect of celebrating Ryan's achievement, and possibly discussing their plans for independence now that they had the financial means to establish their own household. When Ryan arrived home from work that evening, his excitement about the promotion was infectious. He hugged me tightly, thanking me for always believing in him and supporting him through the challenging years. Stephanie seemed pleased as well, though her enthusiasm was tempered by immediate concerns about the increased responsibilities that would come with Ryan's new position and how they would adjust to his potentially longer working hours. Still, the overall mood was positive and celebratory as we gathered in the kitchen where I was putting the finishing touches on our feast. That's when the evening took a turn that shattered something fundamental in my understanding of my place in this household and this family. As I began arranging the beautifully cooked roast beef on the serving platter, Stephanie casually mentioned that she had already prepared plates for herself and Ryan, portioning out generous servings of the best pieces of meat along with ample helpings of the roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and gravy. She handed me a separate plate, one of the everyday dishes rather than the china I had set on the dining room table, containing what could only be described as scraps. The portions on my plate were not simply smaller, they were fundamentally different in quality. The pieces of beef were the end cuts that were overcooked and tough, the vegetables were the ones that had been slightly burned or had broken apart during cooking, and the small amount of gravy had already begun to congeal and separate. It was the kind of plate you might prepare for yourself when you were finishing up leftovers several days after a meal, not something you would serve to a guest, much less the person who had purchased, prepared, and cooked the entire dinner. The casual way Stephanie handed me this plate, as if it were perfectly normal and appropriate, was perhaps more shocking than the contents themselves. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that anything unusual was happening. She and Ryan simply took their generous portions to the dining room table and began eating, leaving me standing in the kitchen holding a plate of scraps and trying to process what had just occurred. In that moment, standing alone in my own kitchen, holding a plate of leftover scraps from a meal I had lovingly prepared to celebrate my son's success, I experienced a clarity that had been building for years, but had never crystallized so completely. This wasn't thoughtlessness or oversight. This wasn't stress or poor judgment. This was a deliberate statement about my value in this household, about my place in this family, and about the relationship that had evolved between us over the years. Of my generosity and their acceptance, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had transformed from being Ryan's mother and the owner of this house into being something more like an elderly relative who was tolerated in exchange for the services I provided. My contributions had become invisible and expected, while my needs and dignity had become secondary to their comfort and preferences. The woman who had raised Ryan, who had worked for 40 years to build a comfortable life, who had opened her home and her heart to help them through difficult times, had somehow become someone worthy only of table scraps in her own home. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been the result of a single conversation or decision. It had been the accumulation of hundreds of small compromises, tiny concessions, and gradual accommodations that had shifted the balance of power and respect so completely that serving me dinner scraps felt natural and appropriate to my daughter-in-law. Each time I had chosen to avoid conflict by accepting less than I deserved, each time I had prioritized their comfort over my own dignity, each time I had made excuses for behavior that diminished my worth, I had participated in creating this dynamic. But understanding how I had arrived at this moment didn't make it any less devastating or any more acceptable. As I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my care and effort, holding a plate that represented how little my contributions were valued, I felt something shift inside me that couldn't be shifted back. The woman who had spent years avoiding confrontation, making excuses, and absorbing disrespect was done. It was time for Helen Carter to remember who she was and what she deserved, and it was time for everyone else to remember it too. The morning after the dinner incident, I woke with a peculiar sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The humiliation of the previous evening had crystallized into something harder and more resolute. As I lay in bed, listening to the numb sounds of Ryan and Stephanie moving around what they had come to consider their domain, I made a decision that would change everything. I would no longer be a passive participant in my own diminishment. My first step was to call Benjamin Walsh. It was early, barely 7 in the morning, but I knew he was an early riser who often arrived at Hartford Medical Center before most of the staff. When his familiar voice answered, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in months. "Benjamin, it's Helen Carter. I hope I'm not calling too early, but I wanted to discuss something important with you." There was genuine warmth in his response. "Helen, you know you can call me any time. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "You've mentioned several times over the past few months that the medical center has been struggling with administrative transitions since my retirement. I wanted to know if that offer of consulting work was genuine, or if you were simply being polite." The pause that followed was brief but significant. "Helen, that offer has always been genuine. We've been dealing with issues that, frankly, someone with your experience and institutional knowledge could solve in a matter of weeks. The current staff is competent, but they lack your understanding of how all the systems interconnect. Would you be interested in coming back on a consulting basis?" The relief I felt was immediate and profound. "Yes, Benjamin, I would be very interested. When could we meet to discuss the details?" "How about this afternoon? Say, 2 o'clock in my office? We can go over what we need and work out an arrangement that would be beneficial for both of us." After hanging up, I sat quietly in my bedroom, processing the implications of this conversation. For the first time in years, I was taking action to improve my situation rather than simply enduring it. The consultation work would provide additional income, but more importantly, it would restore my sense of professional identity and self-worth. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Benjamin, choosing one of my better suits that I hadn't worn since my retirement. As I prepared to leave the house, Stephanie emerged from the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking at me with curiosity. "You're dressed up today, Helen. Where are you going?" The question carried an undertone of entitlement that would have made me defensive in the past. Today, I simply smiled and answered honestly. "I have a business meeting at Hartford Medical Center. I may be taking on some consulting work." Stephanie's expression shifted to something between surprise and concern. "Consulting work? But Helen, you're retired. And honestly, do you think it's wise to take on professional responsibilities at your age? You've seemed so tired lately, and the stress might not be good for your health." There it was again, the subtle suggestion that I was becoming frail and incapable, disguised as concern for my well-being. I recognize the pattern now, and I refuse to accept it. Actually, Stephanie, I feel more energetic than I have in years. The prospect of using my skills again is quite invigorating. I think you'll find that I'm more capable than you've given me credit for. I left before she could respond, feeling lighter with each step toward my car. The drive to Hartford Medical Center was familiar and comforting, a journey I had made thousands of times during my working years. As I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a sense of homecoming that surprised me with its intensity. Benjamin's office looked exactly as I remembered it, organized and professional with windows that overlooked the main hospital complex. He greeted me with a warm handshake and immediately began explaining the challenges the medical center was facing. Helen, I'm not exaggerating when I say that your departure created a gap we haven't been able to fill adequately. The new administrative staff is struggling with patient record transitions, insurance processing coordination, and vendor management. These are all areas where you developed systems and relationships over decades that we're now trying to recreate from scratch. As he outlined the specific problems they were encountering, I felt my professional instincts awakening. These were challenges I had faced and solved before, systems I had designed and implemented, relationships I had cultivated and maintained. I found myself asking detailed questions, making mental notes, and already beginning to formulate solutions. What I'm proposing, Benjamin continued, is a 6-month consulting contract, with the possibility of extension if both parties are satisfied. You would work approximately 20 hours per week, with flexibility to work from home when possible. The compensation would be $75 per hour, which I believe reflects both the value of your expertise and the urgent nature of our needs. I tried to maintain my composure, but the numbers were staggering. 20 hours per week. At $75 per hour would provide me with $6,000 per month, more than doubling my retirement income. This wasn't just professional validation. It was financial independence on a scale I had never imagined possible. Benjamin, those terms are very generous. I accept your offer. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, timelines, and specific objectives. I would start the following Monday, beginning with a comprehensive assessment of current systems and procedures. Benjamin would provide me with an office space and full access to all relevant databases and personnel. As I drove home, I felt a transformation occurring that went beyond the practical benefits of the consulting position. I was remembering who I had been before years of gradual accommodation had eroded my sense of self-worth. I was Helen Carter, a woman who had built a successful career through competence and dedication, who had raised a son while managing professional responsibilities, who had earned the respect of colleagues and supervisors through decades of excellent work. The house on Pine Ridge Avenue looked different when I returned, somehow smaller and less significant than it had seemed that morning. Ryan was at work, but Stephanie was in the living room, watching television with an expression of barely concealed irritation. "How was your meeting?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected to hear about disappointment or rejection. "Excellent. I start work next Monday as a consultant to Hartford Medical Center. The position will require approximately 20 hours per week and will provide substantial additional income to our household budget." Stephanie's reaction was immediate but complex. I could see her processing the implications of this news, recognizing that my increased income would change the financial dynamics that had given her considerable power over household decisions. "That's wonderful, Helen," she said, though her enthusiasm seemed forced. "Though I hope you won't overextend yourself. And of course, with Ryan's promotion, we'll be able to contribute more to household expenses now. In fact, we've been discussing the possibility of finding our own place soon." This was the first time in months that Stephanie had mentioned moving out without prompting from me. The timing was interesting, coming immediately after I had announced my increased earning potential. I suspected this had more to do with maintaining control over their living situation than with any genuine desire for independence. "Of course," I replied neutrally, "though there's no rush from my perspective. I'm quite comfortable with our current arrangement." This was a subtle shift in the power dynamic that I could see Stephanie recognized immediately. By removing any pressure for them to move out, I was also removing their ability to use the threat of leaving as leverage for better treatment or continued financial support. Over the weekend, I began preparing for my return to professional life. I reviewed my old files, updated my wardrobe with a few new pieces appropriate for consulting work, and organized a home office space in what had been a rarely used guest room. The activity felt purposeful and energizing in ways I had forgotten were possible. Ryan was supportive and genuinely pleased about my new position, though I noticed he seemed somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of his mother returning to work after retirement. During our conversation about the consulting opportunity, he expressed concerns that were remarkably similar to those Stephanie had voiced. "Mom, I think it's great that Benjamin values your expertise so highly, but are you sure you want to take on this kind of responsibility? You've earned the right to relax and enjoy your retirement, and with my promotion, you don't need to worry about financial pressures anymore." I looked at my son, seeing echoes of the thoughtful boy I had raised, but also recognizing how thoroughly he had absorbed Stephanie's narrative about my increasing frailty and dependence. The idea that I might want professional fulfillment and financial independence for reasons beyond necessity seemed foreign to him. "Ryan, I appreciate your concern, but I'm taking this position because I want to, not because I need to. I miss using my skills and knowledge in meaningful ways. This opportunity will allow me to contribute to something important while maintaining my independence." The word independence seemed to catch his attention in a way that suggested he hadn't considered that I might value autonomy for its own sake. In his mind, and apparently in Stephanie's as well, my role was to be the grateful recipient of their tolerance and occasional assistance, not an independent agent with my own goals and preferences. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October in Connecticut. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that conveyed professionalism without ostentation, applied makeup with more care than I had taken in months, and left the house before Ryan and Stephanie were fully awake. The early departure was intentional. I wanted to establish from the beginning that my professional commitments would take precedence over household routines and expectations. Hartford Medical Center buzzed with the familiar energy of a busy healthcare facility. Staff members I had worked with for years greeted me with genuine enthusiasm and relief. Many commented on how much they had missed my organizational skills and institutional knowledge. The warm reception was both gratifying and revelatory. I had forgotten how respected and valued I had been in this environment. Benjamin had arranged for me to have an office in the administrative wing, a space that was modest but private and well-equipped. My first day was spent reviewing current procedures, interviewing key staff members, and identifying the most critical areas for improvement. Within hours, I had compiled a list of immediate fixes that could significantly improve efficiency and reduce ongoing problems. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways I had forgotten were possible. Problems that had been frustrating. The current staff for months were familiar challenges that I had solved before. Systems that seemed complex and overwhelming to newer employees were logical extensions of processes I had developed over decades. I found myself working with an energy and focus that surprised even me. By the end of my first week, I had implemented several immediate improvements and outlined a comprehensive plan for addressing the larger systemic issues. Benjamin was clearly impressed, and I could see relief in his expression as he reviewed my progress reports. "Helen, I knew you were good at your job, but I had forgotten just how good. You've accomplished more in 5 days than we've managed in the past 6 months." The validation was professional rather than personal, based on concrete results rather than sympathy or obligation. It reminded me of who I had been before years of gradual diminishment had eroded my confidence and self-respect. Meanwhile, the dynamics at home were shifting in subtle but significant ways. My increased income meant that I no longer needed to stretch every dollar to cover household expenses. I could afford better food, occasional luxuries, and small improvements to the house that I had been deferring due to budget constraints. More importantly, my professional commitments provided a legitimate reason to limit my availability for household tasks and social obligations that had gradually become burdensome. When Stephanie complained about the temperature in the house, I simply adjusted the thermostat to my preferred setting and mentioned that my increased earnings could easily cover any additional utility costs. When she criticized the meals I prepared, I offered to provide her with a grocery budget so she could plan and cook meals according to her preferences. When she expressed frustration about household chores, I suggested that my consulting income could fund a cleaning service if she felt the workload was becoming unmanageable. Each of these responses was reasonable and generous, but they fundamentally altered the power dynamic that had developed over the years. Instead of absorbing criticism and adjusting my behavior to accommodate her preferences, I was offering solutions that required her to take responsibility for her own comfort and satisfaction. The most significant change, however, was in my relationship with Ryan. My professional success and increased confidence seemed to remind him of aspects of my personality that had been suppressed during the years of accommodation and compromise. He began asking for my advice on work-related challenges, consulting me about financial decisions, and expressing genuine interest in my consulting projects. During one of our conversations, he made an observation that revealed how much the household dynamics had changed. "Mom, you seem different lately. More like yourself, if that makes sense. I hadn't realized how much I missed seeing you engaged and enthusiastic about something." The comment was both touching and concerning. It suggested that Ryan had noticed my gradual diminishment over the years, but hadn't recognized the role that living arrangements and family dynamics had played in that change. He had accepted my increasing passivity and deference as natural consequences of aging, rather than responses to being consistently devalued and marginalized. Stephanie's reaction to these changes was more complex and less positive. She seemed to recognize that my professional success and financial independence were undermining her ability to control household decisions and dynamics. Her comments about my work became increasingly critical, focusing on concerns about my health, my ability to handle stress, and the wisdom of taking on professional responsibilities at my age. "Helen, I've been watching you lately, and I'm worried about how tired you look. This consulting work seems to be taking a toll on your health. Maybe you should consider stepping back before it becomes too much to handle." These expressions of concern might have seemed genuine to an outside observer, but I had learned to recognize the pattern. Stephanie was most worried about my well-being when I was doing things that increased my independence or challenged the status quo that had developed in our household. "Actually, Stephanie, I feel more energetic and engaged than I have in years. The work is stimulating rather than exhausting, and the additional income has reduced the financial stress I was experiencing. I think you'll find that I'm handling the responsibilities quite well." My response was calm and factual, but it clearly communicated that I would not be accepting her assessment of my capabilities or her suggestions about my limitations. The shift in my demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, and I could see that she recognized the change even if she couldn't articulate exactly what was different. The transformation wasn't just internal. It was beginning to manifest in concrete ways that would soon force everyone in the household to confront the new reality. Helen Carter was no longer the accommodating elderly relative who could be managed and controlled through subtle manipulation and false concern. She was a competent, professional woman with her own income, her own goals, and her own standards for how she expected to be treated. The question now was whether Ryan and Stephanie would adapt to this new dynamic, or whether they would escalate their efforts to maintain the control and advantages they had grown accustomed to. Based on Stephanie's increasingly pointed comments, and Ryan's confused attempts to navigate between his wife's expectations and his mother's changing behavior, I suspected that bigger confrontations were coming. But for the first time in years, I was prepared for those confrontations. I had rediscovered my professional competence, my financial independence, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them as Helen Carter, not as someone's burden or someone's source of free housing and support. The dinner scraps incident had been a wake-up call, but it was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. I was finally ready to reclaim my life, my home, and my dignity, regardless of the cost or the consequences. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered in the form of a phone call that would change everything. I was working in my home office, reviewing patient discharge protocols for Hartford Medical Center, when Benjamin called with news that left me speechless. "Helen, I have something extraordinary to discuss with you. Can you come in this afternoon? This conversation needs to happen in person." The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and I agreed to meet him at 2:00. As I drove to the medical center, I couldn't imagine what could be so important that it required immediate face-to-face discussion. Our consulting arrangement was going exceptionally well, and I had already exceeded the objectives we had set for the first month. Benjamin's office door was closed when I arrived, which was unusual for him. His secretary gestured for me to go right in, and I found him standing by the window, looking unusually formal and serious. "Helen, please sit down. What I'm about to tell you is confidential and, quite frankly, unprecedented in my experience." I settled into the chair across from his desk, my curiosity now mixed with concern. Benjamin returned to his seat and pulled out a thick folder. "Do you remember Dr. Margaret Henley, the cardiologist who retired 3 years ago?" I nodded. Dr. Henley had been one of my favorite physicians to work with, always respectful and appreciative of the administrative support staff. She had been widowed for many years and had no children, dedicating her life entirely to her medical practice and her patients. Dr. Henley passed away last month while traveling in Europe. Her attorney contacted me yesterday because her will contains some very specific instructions regarding you. My breath caught. I had barely known Dr. Henley outside of our professional interactions, though she had always been kind to me and had made a point of thanking me personally when she retired. Benjamin opened the folder and pulled out several legal documents. "Helen, Dr. Henley has left you her house, the entire property on Maple Street, fully paid off, along with a trust fund established to cover property taxes, maintenance, and utilities for the next 20 years. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed this information. Dr. Henley's house on Maple Street was one of the most beautiful properties in Maplewood, a sprawling colonial with mature gardens and a view of the Connecticut River. I had driven past it countless times, always admiring its elegance and wondering about the life lived within its walls. "I don't understand," I managed to say. "Why would she leave me her house? We barely knew each other outside of work." Benjamin smiled, pulling out an envelope with my name written in Dr. Henley's distinctive handwriting. "She left this letter for you. I think it will explain everything." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Helen, if you are reading this letter, then I have completed my final journey, and you are learning about my gift to you. I imagine you are surprised and perhaps confused by my decision, so please allow me to explain. During my 37 years of practice at Hartford Medical Center, I worked with dozens of administrative staff members, nurses, and support personnel. Most were competent and professional, but very few demonstrated the exceptional character and dedication that I observed in you consistently over the 15 years we worked together. I watched you manage complex situations with grace, treat every patient and family member with dignity regardless of their circumstances, and somehow maintain warmth and humanity in an environment that can easily become cold and bureaucratic. More importantly, I observed how you handled your personal challenges with quiet strength and resilience. I knew about your husband's death, your financial struggles as a single parent, and the sacrifices you made to ensure your son's success. I also knew, though you never complained or asked for help, that you were providing financial and emotional support to your adult son and his wife in ways that were straining your resources and limiting your own opportunities for happiness. I have no children of my own, and my estate planning has always been complicated by the lack of obvious heirs. I considered various charitable donations, but ultimately decided that the most meaningful use of my resources would be to provide security and independence to someone who had spent her life caring for others without adequate recognition or reciprocity. The house on Maple Street has been my sanctuary for 25 years. It is where I found peace after difficult days, where I entertained friends and colleagues, where I pursued my interests in gardening and reading. I cannot think of anyone who would appreciate and deserve such a sanctuary more than you. The trust fund I have established will ensure that you never need to worry about the practical aspects of homeownership. The house is yours to enjoy without financial burden, to modify according to your preferences, and to use as the foundation for whatever new chapter of life you choose to create. You have spent decades putting others' needs before your own. Consider this my prescription for your future. Live for yourself, Helen. Pursue your own happiness, establish your own priorities, and never again allow anyone to diminish your worth or take advantage of your generosity. With deep respect and warm regards, Dr. Margaret Henley. I read the letter twice, tears streaming down my face by the time I finished. The generosity was overwhelming, but even more meaningful was Dr. Henley's recognition of my character and circumstances. Someone had seen my struggles, acknowledged my sacrifices, and chosen to honor them in the most tangible way possible. Helen, Benjamin said gently, there are some legal procedures to complete, but the house is effectively yours immediately. Dr. Henley's attorney has already arranged for the deed transfer and trust fund establishment. You could move in as early as next week if you choose to. The implications hit me like a physical force. I owned a beautiful house, completely debt-free, with ongoing expenses covered by a trust fund. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete financial and residential independence. I could live anywhere I wanted, make any decisions I pleased, and never again need to compromise my comfort or dignity for the sake of economic security. Benjamin, I need some time to process. This? It's almost too much to believe. Of course, he replied. Take all the time you need. The attorney's contact information is in this folder, along with all the relevant documents. And Helen, if I may say so, Dr. Henley made an excellent choice. You deserve every bit of this good fortune. I drove home in a daze. The folder of legal documents on the passenger seat representing a complete transformation of my circumstances. The house on Pine Ridge Avenue looked different as I pulled into the driveway, somehow smaller and less significant than it had seemed that morning. This was no longer my primary residence by necessity. It was simply one option among many. Ryan was at work and Stephanie was out shopping, giving me privacy to fully absorb what had happened. I walked through the rooms of the house I had called home for decades, seeing everything with new eyes. The furniture that needed updating, the worn carpets, the outdated kitchen fixtures that I had been unable to afford to replace. These were no longer permanent features of my life that I had to accept. They were temporary inconveniences in a transitional space. More importantly, I began to see the living arrangement with Ryan and Stephanie in an entirely new context. What had felt like my only option for companionship and family connection was actually a choice I had been making daily, often to my own detriment. I no longer needed their tolerance or acceptance. I no longer needed to accommodate their preferences to maintain my housing security. I could choose to live with them or choose to live independently, based entirely on how they treated me and whether the relationship enhanced or diminished my happiness. That evening, I said nothing about Dr. Henley's bequest. I wanted to process the information fully before sharing it with anyone, and I was curious to observe the household dynamics with my new knowledge that these dynamics were entirely optional from my perspective. Dinner that night was particularly revealing. Stephanie had prepared a meal using groceries I had purchased, and she served herself and Ryan generous portions while giving me a significantly smaller serving. claiming she thought I was trying to watch my weight. It was the same pattern of subtle disrespect that had become routine, but now I saw it clearly for what it was. The behavior of someone who felt entitled to control resources and decisions in a home that wasn't hers. "Helen," Stephanie said as we ate, "I wanted to talk to you about the holidays. My mother is planning to visit for Thanksgiving and she'll need somewhere to stay. I was thinking she could use your bedroom, and you could sleep on the pull-out sofa in the living room for the week she's here. It would be so much more comfortable for her, and I know you wouldn't mind making that sacrifice for family." The assumption that I would automatically agree to give up my own bedroom in my own house for a week to accommodate her mother's comfort was breathtaking. The casual way she presented this as a reasonable request, without even asking if it would be acceptable to me, demonstrated how completely she had come to view me as subordinate to her wishes and her family's convenience. In the past, I would have reluctantly agreed, probably convincing myself that being accommodating was the kind and appropriate response. Tonight, with the knowledge of my complete independence fresh in my mind, I saw the request for what it truly was: an assumption that my comfort and dignity were less important than her mother's, and that my role in this household was to facilitate their social and family obligations, regardless of the impact on me. Actually, Stephanie, that arrangement wouldn't work for me. If your mother needs accommodation, I'd be happy to help you. Research hotels in the area or contribute toward the cost of her stay somewhere nearby. The surprise on both Ryan's and Stephanie's faces was immediate and unmistakable. This was clearly not the response they had expected or experienced from me in similar situations. "But, Helen," Stephanie pressed, "it's just for 1 week, and it would mean so much to have her stay here with family. Hotels are so expensive and impersonal. I'm sure you understand how important family time is, especially during the holidays." The manipulation was obvious now, the appeal to family loyalty designed to make me feel selfish for prioritizing my own comfort. But I was no longer the woman who could be guilted into sacrificing her own needs for others' convenience. "I do understand the importance of family time," I replied calmly, "which is why I'm sure your mother will appreciate having her own space and privacy in a hotel room rather than displacing an elderly woman from her own bedroom." Ryan shifted, uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had changed in my responses, but unable to articulate exactly what was different. "Mom, are you feeling all right? You seem different lately. More tense, maybe? Is the consulting work becoming too stressful? Maybe you should consider cutting back on your hours if it's affecting your mood." There it was again, the suggestion that any deviation from complete accommodation and submission must be evidence of declining health or excessive stress. The implication that standing up for myself was a symptom of a problem rather than a sign of psychological health and appropriate boundaries. "I'm feeling better than I have in years, Ryan. The consulting work is energizing and fulfilling, and I'm finally beginning to remember what it feels like to have my efforts appreciated and my expertise valued. I think you'll find that I'm actually handling stress much better now that I'm not constantly compromising my own needs and preferences." The conversation ended in uncomfortable silence, with both Ryan and Stephanie clearly uncertain how to respond to this new version of me. I excused myself early, retreating to my bedroom to review the documents Benjamin had given me, and to begin planning for what came next. The house on Maple Street was even more beautiful than I had remembered. The online real estate record showed over 4,000 square feet of living space, including a master suite with river views, a gourmet kitchen, a library, and a sunroom. That would be perfect for morning coffee and evening reading. The grounds included mature gardens, a greenhouse, and enough privacy to ensure complete tranquility. I spent hours that night imagining myself in that space, making decisions based solely on my own preferences, decorating according to my own taste, establishing routines that served my own comfort and happiness. For the first time in years, I was excited about the future in ways that had nothing to do with other people's needs or expectations. The next morning, I called Dr. Henley's attorney to begin the formal transfer process. The legal procedures were surprisingly straightforward, requiring only my signature on several documents and my presence at a brief meeting with the estate executor. By Friday afternoon, I held the keys to my new home and the documentation proving my ownership of one of the most desirable properties in Maplewood. I drove to Maple Street that evening, using the key to enter what was now my house. The interior was even more impressive than I had anticipated, furnished with elegant pieces that Dr. Henley had collected over decades of comfortable living. Everything was in perfect condition, from the hardwood floors to the crown molding to the updated appliances in the kitchen. Standing in the master bedroom, looking out at the Connecticut River through tall windows, I felt a profound sense of possibility that I hadn't experienced since I was young. This was my space, my sanctuary, my foundation for whatever new life I chose to create. No one could take it away from me, criticize my choices about it, or make demands on how I used it. I spent the weekend quietly moving some of my personal belongings to the new house, saying nothing to Ryan or Stephanie about my activities. They assumed I was working additional hours on my consulting projects, and I saw no reason to correct their assumption. I wanted to establish myself in the new space and plan my next steps before revealing the dramatic change in my circumstances. The house felt like home almost immediately. I arranged my books in the library, set up a workspace in the sunroom, and began making small changes that reflected my personal taste, rather than compromises negotiated with other people. Each decision I made independently, from the temperature setting to the television programs I watched to the meals I prepared, reinforced my growing sense of autonomy and self-determination. By Sunday evening, I had made my decision about how to proceed. I would tell Ryan and Stephanie about the inheritance on Monday evening, but I would do so after presenting them with another piece of information that would make the conversation much more interesting. Monday morning, I drove to Pine Ridge Avenue, one final time as a resident. I had an appointment with a real estate attorney at 10 o'clock, and I wanted to complete that business before returning to work at Hartford Medical Center. The attorney's office was in downtown Maplewood, in a brick building that housed several professional services. I had made the appointment to discuss a very specific legal matter, one that I had been researching over the weekend. "Mrs. Carter," the attorney said as I settled into his office, "you mentioned on the phone that you needed advice about property ownership and tenancy issues. How can I help you?" I pulled out the folder of documents I had prepared, including the deed to the Pine Ridge Avenue house that showed Thomas and me as the original purchasers, with full ownership transferring to me upon his death. I own a house that has been occupied by my son and daughter-in-law for several years. They have never paid rent or signed any formal lease agreement, and they have gradually taken control of the property in ways that have made me uncomfortable. I would like to know what legal options I have for asking them to leave if I choose to do so. The attorney reviewed my documentation carefully, asking several questions about the living arrangements, financial contributions, and any written agreements that might exist. "Mrs. Carter, based on what you've told me, your son and daughter-in-law are what we would legally classify as tenants at will. Since they have been living there for more than a year without paying rent, they have certain rights. But as the property owner, you have the right to terminate their tenancy with proper notice." He pulled out a legal form and began explaining the process. In Connecticut, you would need to provide them with written notice to quit the premises, giving them 30 days to vacate. The notice must be served properly, either by hand delivery with a witness or by certified mail. If they refuse to leave after the 30-day period, you would need to file for formal eviction through the courts. But given that you're the clear owner of the property and there's no lease agreement, the process would be straightforward. I studied the form he had given me, noting the formal language that would legally require Ryan and Stephanie to vacate my property within 30 days. of receiving the notice. How quickly could such a notice be prepared and served? I asked. I could have it prepared today if you decide to proceed. The service could be completed by tomorrow if necessary. I thought about the dinner scraps, about Stephanie's casual assumption that I would give up my bedroom for her mother's comfort, about the years of gradual disrespect and diminishment that had led to this moment. Please prepare the notice, I said. I'll need 2 copies, one for each of them. As I left the attorney's office with the eviction notices in my briefcase, I felt a calm determination that surprised me with its intensity. This wasn't anger or vindictiveness. It was simply the logical consequence of years of behavior that had demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for me and my property. Tonight, I would serve Ryan and Stephanie their eviction notices. Then I would tell them about Dr. Henley's bequest and my new living arrangements. It was time for everyone to understand that Helen Carter was no longer available to be taken for granted, manipulated, or treated as a secondary concern in her own life. The woman who had accepted dinner scraps in her own home was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to demand that others recognize it as well. I arrived home that Monday evening with the eviction notices sealed in official envelopes, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. Ryan's car was already in the driveway, and I could see lights on throughout the house. That had been my home for decades, but would soon return to being mine alone. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves from neighboring yards, a reminder that seasons change and life moves forward, whether we resist or embrace the transformation. Walking through the front door, I heard the familiar sounds of domestic life. Ryan was in the living room watching television, while Stephanie's voice carried from the kitchen where she was apparently on the phone with someone, complaining about the cost of groceries and how difficult it was to manage household expenses on their budget. The irony of her complaint, given that I had been covering the majority of those expenses for years, was not lost on me. I placed my briefcase on the hallway table and removed my coat, taking a moment to center myself for what was coming. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about establishing truth and demanding the respect that should have been freely given long ago. I had spent too many years being accommodating to the point of self-erasure, and tonight marked the beginning of my return to authentic living. "Ryan," I called out, keeping my voice level and calm. "Could you ask Stephanie to join us in the dining room? I have something important to discuss with both of you." He looked up from the television with mild curiosity, probably expecting another conversation about household logistics or schedule coordination. "Sure, Mom. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I replied, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had said in months. Everything was finally, truly fine, though they didn't know it yet. Stephanie emerged from the kitchen still holding her phone, clearly irritated at being interrupted from her conversation. "Helen, can this wait? I'm trying to coordinate Thanksgiving plans with my mother, and you know how she gets when calls are cut short." The assumption that her phone conversation took precedence over my request for a family meeting was so typical that I almost smiled. In a few minutes, she would understand that her mother's convenience would no longer be driving decisions in this household. "This won't take long," I said, settling into my chair at the head of the dining room table. "Please, both of you, sit down." Ryan took his usual seat, but Stephanie remained standing, her posture conveying impatience and barely concealed annoyance. The dynamic was familiar. Ryan attempting to maintain peace by complying with requests, Stephanie asserting her priorities through resistance and inconvenience. Tonight, however, the dynamic was about to shift permanently. I opened my briefcase and withdrew the 2 envelopes, placing them on the table in front of me. The official legal letterhead was visible through the envelope windows, and I saw Ryan's expression change from casual attention to genuine concern. "Ryan, Stephanie, I need to inform you of some significant changes that will be taking effect immediately." I kept my voice steady and professional, drawing on decades of experience delivering important information clearly and without unnecessary emotion. Stephanie finally sat down, her phone forgotten as she focused on the envelopes. "Helen, you're being very dramatic. What changes are you talking about?" Instead of answering immediately, I pushed one envelope toward each of them. "These are formal notices regarding your residency in this house. I think you should read them carefully." Ryan picked up his envelope with obvious reluctance, while Stephanie grabbed hers and tore it open aggressively, as if her impatience could somehow change whatever information it contained. I watched their faces as they read, seeing confusion transform into shock and then into anger. "Mom," Ryan said slowly, his voice strained. "This is an eviction notice." You're evicting us? Your own son?" "This is ridiculous," Stephanie interrupted, waving the document in the air. "Helen, you can't be serious. You can't just throw us out of our home. We have rights." The word home hung in the air between us, heavy with assumption and entitlement. This was my home, had always been my home, purchased with money I had earned and maintained with resources I continued to provide. The fact that they had gradually come to view it as their domain, their property to control and occupy indefinitely, was precisely the problem I was addressing. "This is my home," I said quietly but firmly. "You have been guests here for years, guests who have gradually forgotten the courtesy and gratitude appropriate to that status. The notices give you 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements." Ryan set his envelope down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "Mom, I don't understand. Where is this coming from? If we've done something to upset you, we can talk about it. We can work things out. You don't need to resort to legal action against your own family." The bewilderment in his voice was genuine, and for a moment I felt the familiar tug of maternal concern that had guided so many of my decisions over the years. But then I remembered the dinner scraps, the casual disrespect, the years of being treated as a resource rather than a person deserving of basic consideration. "Ryan, this isn't about one incident or one problem. This is about a pattern of behavior that has made me feel unwelcome and unvalued in my own home. You've both made it clear through your actions that you view me as an obligation to be managed, rather than a person to be respected." Stephanie's shock was rapidly transforming into fury. "This is insane, Helen. We've been nothing but supportive and helpful. We've taken care of you, included you in our lives, made sure you weren't lonely. And this is how you repay us? By throwing us out on the street?" The distortion of reality in her response was breathtaking. In her mind, serving me dinner scraps while enjoying meals I had provided represented caring for me. Taking control of my living space and dismissing my preferences constituted including me in their lives. Tolerating my presence in my own home equated to preventing my loneliness. "Stephanie, I think your perspective on our living arrangement differs significantly from mine. But that's actually beside the point now, because I have other news to share that will put everything in context." I reached into my briefcase again and withdrew the folder containing Dr. Henley's bequest documents. Both Ryan and Stephanie watched, my movements with the intensity of people who sensed that more surprises were coming, and none of them were likely to be pleasant from their perspective. 3 days ago, I learned that Dr. Margaret Henley, one of the physicians I worked with for many years, passed away recently. She left me her house on Maple Street, along with a trust fund to cover all associated expenses. The silence that followed was profound. I could see them processing this information, trying to understand the implications not just for me, but for their own circumstances. Ryan spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Henley left you her house? The big colonial by the river?" "Yes, I've already completed the legal transfer and moved most of my belongings there. I'm now the owner of one of the most beautiful properties in Maplewood, with no mortgage, no financial concerns, and complete independence to live exactly as I choose." Stephanie's expression had gone through several rapid changes, from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like panic. But Helen, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell us about this immediately? We could have celebrated, made plans together. This is wonderful news for the whole family. The speed with which her tone shifted from fury to forced enthusiasm was remarkable. Suddenly, I wasn't the unreasonable elderly woman throwing them out unjustly. I was a family member whose good fortune should benefit everyone. The transparent calculation in her response confirmed everything I had come to understand about her character and motivations. I didn't share the news immediately because I wanted to make my own decisions about how this inheritance would affect my life. And I've decided that it's time for me to live independently, in my own space, according to my own preferences and schedule. Ryan leaned forward, his expression earnest and pleading. Mom, I understand that you want your own space, and that's great. That's wonderful. But why does that mean we have to leave? This house is big enough for all of us. We could work out new arrangements, maybe contribute more to expenses now that my promotion came through. We could make this work for everyone. The offer to contribute financially to the household was interesting, coming only after he learned about my inheritance and the eviction notices. For years, their minimal contributions had been presented as generous assistance to me. Now suddenly they were prepared to pay their fair share, but only when faced with the loss of free housing. Ryan, the issue isn't money. The issue is respect, consideration, and the basic courtesy that should exist between people sharing a living space. Those things have been absent from our arrangement for a long time, and I don't believe they can be restored simply by changing the financial dynamics. Stephanie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is absolutely unbelievable. Helen, you're destroying this family over nothing. Over what exactly? Because you're upset about some imagined slights? Because you think we haven't been grateful enough for your generosity? The word imagined struck me like a physical blow. After years of accepting diminished treatment, of making excuses for their behavior, of convincing myself that I was being too sensitive or expecting too much, here was confirmation that my experiences would always be dismissed as products of my imagination, rather than legitimate concerns deserving of attention and respect. Stephanie, the slights were not imagined. They were consistent, escalating, and ultimately intolerable. The dinner scraps you served me last week while you and Ryan enjoyed the meal I had purchased and prepared were not imagined. The assumption that I would give up my bedroom for your mother's comfort without even being asked for my consent was not imagined. The years of being treated as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected were not imagined. Ryan looked genuinely confused by my reference to dinner scraps, which told me that he hadn't even noticed how I had been served that evening. The casual nature of the disrespect had become so normalized that it was invisible to him, just part of the household routine that he accepted without question. Mom, I honestly don't remember anything about dinner scraps. If something happened that upset you, why didn't you say something at the time? How are we supposed to know we've done something wrong if you don't tell us? The question revealed the fundamental disconnect between us. In Ryan's mind, I was responsible for managing my own mistreatment by speaking up when I was being disrespected. The burden was on me to identify and object to inappropriate behavior, rather than on them to treat me with basic consideration as a matter of course. Ryan, I shouldn't need to ask to be treated with dignity in my own home. The fact that you didn't notice how your wife served me a plate of scraps while you both enjoyed generous portions of a meal I had provided and prepared should tell you something about how normal such treatment has become in this household. Stephanie's patience with the conversation was clearly exhausted. Fine, Helen. Fine. Maybe I was having an off day. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe I made some mistakes. But this response is completely disproportionate. You're breaking up a family over table manners. The reduction of years of systematic disrespect to table manners was so minimizing that I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I had experienced in years. This wasn't about etiquette or social niceties. This was about fundamental human dignity and the right to be treated with respect in one's own home. This isn't about table manners, Stephanie. This is about a pattern of behavior that has made it clear that you view me as an obstacle to your comfort rather than a person deserving of consideration. The eviction notices stand. You have 30 days to find alternative housing. Ryan stood up as well, moving toward me with his hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. Mom, please, let's not make any irreversible decisions tonight. Everyone's emotional, everyone's surprised. Why don't we all take some time to cool off, and then we can sit down and work this out like adults? The suggestion that I was acting emotionally rather than rationally was the final straw. I had approached this entire situation with careful planning, legal consultation, and measured decision-making. The idea that my clear thinking should be dismissed as emotional reactivity because it didn't serve their interests was infuriating. Ryan, I have taken time to think about this decision. I have consulted with attorneys, reviewed my options, and chosen the course of action that best serves my needs and well-being. This isn't an emotional outburst. It's a carefully considered decision based on years of observation and experience. Stephanie moved toward the hallway, clearly preparing to leave the room. Well, Helen, I hope you're satisfied. I hope living alone in your big new house makes you happy, because you're going to be very alone. Ryan, we need to start making phone calls. We need to find somewhere to live, and we need to figure out how to break this news to everyone we know. The threat was implicit but clear. She would make sure that everyone in their social circle heard her version of events, painting me as the unreasonable elderly woman who had thrown her own family out of their home for petty reasons. The prospect of social judgment and criticism was supposed to make me reconsider my position, choose family harmony over personal dignity. Stephanie, you're free to tell whatever story you choose to whoever will listen. I'm confident that people who know me will understand that I wouldn't make such a decision lightly or without cause. As she reached the doorway, she turned back one final time. You know what, Helen? Maybe this is for the best. Maybe Ryan deserves better than a mother. Who would choose money and property over family loyalty? Maybe we all deserve better than this. The accusation that I was choosing money over family was particularly galling, given that I had spent years choosing family over my own financial well-being, providing free housing and support at considerable personal cost. Now that I finally had financial independence, the suggestion that my decisions were motivated by greed rather than self-respect was both hypocritical and revealing. After Stephanie left the room, Ryan lingered, his expression a mixture of hurt, confusion, and desperate hope that somehow this situation could still be resolved in his favor. Mom, I love you. You know that, right? Whatever problems we've had, whatever mistakes we've made, I love you and I want you in my life. But if you go through with this, if you actually evict us, I don't know how we come back from that. I don't know how we rebuild our relationship after something like this. The emotional manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Ryan was framing my decision to demand respectful treatment as something that would damage our relationship, rather than recognizing that the relationship had already been damaged by years of disrespectful treatment that I had quietly endured. Ryan, I love you too. I always have, and I always will. But love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment or sacrificing my own well-being for someone else's convenience. If our relationship can't survive my insistence on being treated with basic respect, then perhaps it wasn't as strong as we both believed. He stood there for several more minutes, clearly hoping I would soften, would offer some compromise or alternative that would allow them to maintain their comfortable arrangement while making minimal changes to their behavior. When it became clear that no such offer was coming, he finally nodded and left the room. I remained at the dining room table for a long time after they had gone upstairs, processing the events of the evening and the reactions I had witnessed. The shock, anger, and attempts at manipulation had been entirely predictable, confirming that my assessment of the situation had been accurate. These were not people who would respond to reasonable requests for improved treatment. They were people who viewed any challenge to their comfort and control as an attack to be resisted or circumvented. The next few days were tense and uncomfortable, with Ryan making periodic attempts to negotiate alternatives and Stephanie maintaining an icy hostility that made clear her view that I had betrayed the family through my unreasonable demands. Neither of them seemed to consider the possibility that their own behavior had contributed to this outcome, that years of taking advantage of my generosity and disregarding my comfort might have natural consequences. Their attempts to find alternative housing were half-hearted and strategic, designed more to demonstrate how difficult and expensive it would be for them to move than to actually secure new accommodations. They left real estate listings around the house showing rental prices that were significantly higher than what they had been paying me, which was nothing. They mentioned repeatedly how hard it would be to find a place that met their needs and preferences within their budget. The implicit message was clear. They believed that if they demonstrated sufficient hardship and inconvenience, I would eventually relent and allow them to stay under some modified arrangement. What they failed to understand was that my decision wasn't based on their convenience or comfort. It was based on my own need for dignity and respect, needs that had been ignored for too long to be satisfied by cosmetic changes or temporary improvements in behavior. 2 weeks into the 30-day notice period, Benjamin called with an opportunity that would soon make the situation even more interesting. "Helen, I've been approached by the Regional Hospital Consortium about a consulting position that would be perfect for you. They need someone with your expertise to help coordinate administrative transitions at 3 different facilities. The position would require some travel, but the compensation would be extraordinary, and it would establish you as one of the premier healthcare administration consultants in New England. The opportunity was exciting both professionally and personally. It would provide additional income, expand my professional network, and most importantly, demonstrate that my value and expertise were recognized and sought after by people who had no obligation to flatter or accommodate me." "Tell me more about the position," I said, already imagining myself in conference rooms in Boston and Hartford, solving complex problems and earning the respect of colleagues who valued competence over family obligation. As Benjamin described the scope and requirements of the consulting opportunity, I realized that my new life was expanding in ways I had never imagined possible. I had spent so many years focused on providing support and stability for others that I had forgotten my own potential for growth, achievement, and professional fulfillment. That evening, as I prepared dinner for one in my own kitchen on Maple Street, I reflected on how completely my circumstances had changed in just a few weeks. I was living independently in a beautiful home, pursuing meaningful work that challenged and energized me, and making decisions based entirely on my own values and preferences. The eviction notices had been served, the boundaries had been established, and the consequences of years of disrespectful treatment were finally being experienced by those who had created them. Whatever came next, it would unfold according to terms I had set, in spaces I controlled, with people who recognized my worth rather than taking it for granted. Helen Carter was no longer available to be anyone's burden, anyone's resource, or anyone's victim. She was finally, completely, authentically, herself. The final week of the 30-day eviction period arrived with the crisp clarity of a New England December. Snow had begun to dust the bare branches outside my windows on Maple Street, and the house felt like a sanctuary in ways I had never experienced before. Each morning, I woke to silence broken only by my own choices, coffee brewed to my preferred strength, newspapers read at my own pace, and decisions made without negotiation or compromise. Ryan and Stephanie had found an apartment in neighboring Branford, a modest 2-bedroom unit that would stretch their budget considerably. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of living rent-free in my spacious Victorian home, they were now facing the reality of market-rate housing costs. Their resentment was palpable during the few interactions we had as they prepared for their departure, but I felt no guilt about their circumstances. They were experiencing the natural consequences of choices they had made over years of taking advantage of my generosity. The regional consulting position Benjamin had mentioned had materialized into something even more substantial than initially described. The hospital consortium had offered me a 2-year contract with compensation that exceeded my wildest expectations. I would be traveling between facilities in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, implementing administrative systems and training staff in procedures I had developed over decades of experience. The work would be challenging, prestigious, and financially lucrative beyond anything I had imagined possible at this stage of my life. More importantly, the position represented complete validation of my professional worth by people who had no personal relationship with me, no obligation to be kind, and no agenda beyond securing the best possible expertise for their facilities. After years of having my capabilities questioned and my judgment dismissed by my own family, the enthusiastic recognition of my skills by respected healthcare administrators felt like a professional resurrection. On the morning Ryan and Stephanie were scheduled to complete their move, I was in my home office on Maple Street, reviewing contracts and preparing for a meeting with hospital executives in Hartford. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded me of the person I had been before years of accommodation and compromise had eroded my confidence and sense of purpose. A knock at my front door interrupted my preparation. Through the window, I could see Ryan standing on my porch, looking uncertain and somehow smaller than I remembered. He was alone, without Stephanie, and his posture suggested he had come for a conversation rather than a confrontation. I opened the door, noting how the elegant foyer of Dr. Henley's former home created a different dynamic than the familiar hallway of the Pine Ridge Avenue house. Here, I was clearly the hostess in my own domain, and Ryan was unmistakably a visitor seeking an audience. "Hello, Ryan. Come in. Would you like some coffee?" He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the refined furnishings and sophisticated decor that surrounded us. "This is a beautiful house, Mom. Dr. Henley had excellent taste." She did indeed. "The library is particularly lovely. Please sit down." I gestured toward the living room, where tall windows overlooked the Connecticut River and morning light filtered through sheer curtains. Ryan settled into one of the upholstered chairs while I took a seat on the sofa, maintaining a comfortable but clearly defined distance between us. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you before we finish moving out today. I wanted to try to understand what happened between us, and maybe find a way to repair some of the damage that's been done." His tone was different from our previous conversations, less defensive and more genuinely reflective. I sensed that the reality of actually losing his comfortable living arrangement had prompted some serious self-examination, though I remained cautious about assuming too much from surface changes in attitude. "I'm willing to listen, Ryan. What have you come to understand?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped together in a gesture that reminded me of the serious conversations we had shared when he was younger and facing difficult decisions about his future. "I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling disrespected and taken for granted. At first, I thought you were being overly sensitive, maybe overreacting to small things because you were stressed or lonely. But then I started really remembering specific incidents, paying attention to patterns I had been ignoring. This was promising. The acknowledgement that he had been dismissing my concerns as oversensitivity was a crucial first step toward understanding what had actually been happening in our household. The dinner scraps thing, Mom. I didn't notice it when it happened, but when I thought back, I remembered how Stephanie served you that night. And when I started paying attention, I realized it wasn't an isolated incident. There were a lot of times when you got smaller portions, less choice cuts, leftovers while we got fresh servings. The fact that he could now see the pattern that had been invisible to him while it was happening suggested that genuine awareness might be developing, though I wondered whether this recognition would lead to lasting change or simply more sophisticated forms of the same basic dynamic. I also realized that we had been making decisions about your house, your space, your belongings without really consulting you or considering your preferences. We just assumed that because you were letting us live there, you were okay with whatever arrangements we wanted to make. This acknowledgement was significant because it recognized the fundamental issue of respect and consideration that had been at the core of our conflict. The problem hadn't been specific incidents so much as an overall attitude that treated my preferences as less important than their comfort and convenience. Ryan, I appreciate your willingness to examine these patterns and acknowledge what was happening. That shows real maturity and self-awareness. But I need to ask you something important. If I hadn't inherited Dr. Henley's house and gained the financial independence to enforce my boundaries, would you have ever noticed these issues or made any effort to change them? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Ryan struggling with the implications. His honesty in answering would tell me everything I needed to know about whether genuine growth had occurred or whether this conversation was simply damage control, motivated by changed circumstances. I don't know, he said finally. I want to say yes, that I would have eventually recognized the problems and addressed them, but I'm not sure that's true. I think I was comfortable with the way things were because they worked well for me and Stephanie. I wasn't paying attention to how they were affecting you because, honestly, I didn't think I needed to. The admission was painful to hear, but also relieving in its honesty. Ryan was acknowledging that his attention to my well-being had been conditional on convenience rather than genuine care, and that recognition was necessary for any real change to occur. I understand that now, he continued. I understand that I was taking advantage of your generosity and your reluctance to create conflict. I was treating you like you existed primarily to support my life rather than as a person with your own needs and desires that were just as important as mine. Tears were beginning to form in his eyes, and I felt the familiar tug of maternal concern that had guided so many of my decisions over the years. But I had learned to distinguish between appropriate compassion and enabling behavior, and I wasn't going to let emotional manipulation override the boundaries I had established. Ryan, I'm glad you're beginning to understand these dynamics, and I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge your role in creating them. But understanding isn't the same as changing, and I need to see consistent evidence of different behavior before I can trust that real change has occurred. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I know that, Mom. I know I can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. And honestly, I'm not sure I would want it to go back to the way it was, because I can see now that it wasn't healthy for any of us. This perspective suggested a level of insight that went beyond simply wanting to restore the previous arrangement for his own benefit. If Ryan could genuinely recognize that the old dynamic had been unhealthy for everyone involved, there might be hope for building something better in the future. What I'm hoping for, he continued, is a chance to rebuild our relationship on different terms. Terms that respect your independence and your right to make your own choices about your life. I want to be your son in ways that add value to your life rather than creating burdens or obligations. The distinction he was making was crucial, and it suggested that he might finally be beginning to understand the difference between a healthy parent-adult-child relationship and the exploitative dynamic that had developed between us. I'd like that too, Ryan, but it will require patience and consistency from both of us. I need time to trust that these changes are genuine and lasting, and you need time to develop new habits and ways of relating that don't rely on my automatic accommodation of your needs. We talked for another hour, discussing specific ways we might begin to rebuild our relationship on healthier foundations. Ryan expressed genuine interest in my consulting work, asking thoughtful questions about the projects I was undertaking and the challenges I was addressing. For the first time in years, he seemed to see me as an accomplished professional with valuable expertise, rather than simply as his mother whose primary role was to support his life. He also talked about his own therapy, individual sessions he had begun after recognizing how much damage his entitled attitudes had caused in his relationships. The work was difficult and uncomfortable, forcing him to confront aspects of his character that he had previously avoided examining, but he seemed committed to the process of change. As our conversation drew to a close, Ryan stood to leave, and I walked him to the door. On the threshold, he turned back to me with an expression that reminded me of the earnest child he had once been. "Mom, I know I hurt you badly, and I know it's going to take time to repair that damage. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even though it was painful for me to experience the consequences. You deserved better than what you were getting from us, and I'm glad you finally decided to demand it." The acknowledgement was perhaps the most meaningful thing he had said during our entire conversation. Ryan was recognizing that my decision to enforce boundaries hadn't been an attack on him, but rather an appropriate response to inappropriate treatment, and that recognition suggested real understanding rather than superficial compliance. "Thank you, Ryan. That means a great deal to me." After he left, I returned to my home office and spent the rest of the morning preparing for my afternoon meeting with the hospital consortium executives. The contrast between my previous life and my current circumstances was stark and energizing. Instead of worrying about household conflicts and family drama, I was focusing on professional challenges that utilized my skills and experience in meaningful ways. The meeting in Hartford exceeded my expectations in every way. The executives were impressive professionals who treated me with the respect due to an acknowledged expert in my field. They outlined projects that would require sophisticated problem-solving and system design, exactly the kind of work that had always energized and fulfilled me. The compensation they offered for the expanded consulting arrangement was generous enough to provide complete financial security for the rest of my life, along with the satisfaction of knowing that my expertise was valued and sought after. Over the following months, my new life took shape in ways that consistently surprised me with their richness and fulfillment. The consulting work took me to healthcare facilities throughout New England, where I solved complex administrative problems and trained staff in efficient procedures. My reputation grew quickly within the professional community, leading to additional opportunities and recognition that I had never imagined possible. My relationship with Ryan evolved slowly but steadily toward something healthier and more balanced. He called regularly to check on me, not because he needed something, but because he was genuinely interested in my life and experiences. Our conversations were increasingly focused on my work, my travels, and my perspectives on the challenges I was addressing professionally. For the first time since his childhood, he seemed to see me as a complete person rather than simply as a resource for his own needs. Stephanie remained distant and resentful, unable to accept that her behavior had contributed to the dissolution of their comfortable living arrangement. Ryan's growing independence from her influence became apparent as he began making decisions based on his own values rather than her preferences and expectations. Their marriage faced significant stress as the financial realities of independent living combined with Ryan's changing attitudes toward family relationships and personal responsibility. 6 months after Ryan and Stephanie moved out of my Pine Ridge Avenue house, I received an unexpected call from a real estate agent. The Victorian home had been attracting significant interest from potential buyers, despite not being officially listed for sale. Property values in the neighborhood had increased substantially, and my house was considered one of the most desirable in the area. The conversation prompted me to consider what I wanted to do with the Pine Ridge Avenue property. I had been maintaining it but not living there, and it represented a significant asset that could be converted to additional income or investment opportunities. After consulting with financial advisors, I decided to sell the house and invest the proceeds in a diversified portfolio that would provide additional security for my retirement years. The sale price exceeded my expectations by a considerable margin, providing me with liquid assets that, combined with the trust fund from Dr. Henley's bequest and my consulting income, established a level of financial independence I had never dreamed possible. More importantly, selling the house represented a final break from the past and a complete commitment to the new life I had created for myself. A year after serving those eviction notices, I was living exactly as I chose to live, working on projects that challenged and fulfilled me, and maintaining relationships that added value to my life rather than creating obligations or burdens. The woman who had accepted dinner scraps in her own home was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and insisted that others recognize it as well. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it had required difficult decisions that caused pain for people I loved. But the alternative had been continuing to accept diminished treatment while gradually losing myself in service to others' comfort and convenience. At 70 years old, I had finally learned that self-respect wasn't selfish, that boundaries weren't cruel, and that demanding appropriate treatment wasn't asking too much. Ryan visited me regularly at the Maple Street house, often bringing flowers or small gifts that represented thoughtfulness rather than obligation. Our conversations were rich and varied, covering everything from current events to family memories to professional challenges we were each facing. He had become the kind of adult son I had always hoped to have: independent, respectful, genuinely interested in my welfare and happiness. The regional consulting position had evolved into a permanent arrangement with healthcare systems throughout New England, establishing me as one of the most respected administrative consultants in the field. Professional conferences, speaking engagements, and advisory positions provided intellectual stimulation and social connections that enriched my life in ways I was still discovering. Standing in my library one evening, looking out at the Connecticut River while reviewing proposals for new consulting projects, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The dinner scraps incident had been a catalyst, but the real change had come from recognizing my own value and refusing to accept anything less than appropriate treatment from others. Dr. Henley's bequest had provided the means for independence, but the courage to claim that independence had come from within. The eviction notices had been tools for establishing boundaries, but the strength to maintain those boundaries came from finally understanding that I deserved respect, not because of what I could provide for others, but simply because of who I was. Helen Carter had learned to live for herself, and in doing so, had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined possible. The scraps were gone forever, replaced by a feast of opportunities, relationships, and experiences. That honored the woman she had always been but had finally learned to value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.